Hello, Graphic Design 1. This is going to be your last lecture of the semester. Congratulations, we are winding down. This last lecture is called Pages and Pages of Information and is talking about long format document design. We're specifically going to talk about working with a grid and how you design for a multi-page document, aka your cookbook interior. So this lecture is a little interactive. I give you some chances to shout out the answer, so feel free to do so. And then we're going to do a quick little mini exercise partway through the lecture as well. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay, we're going to start with page anatomy. So some of these terms you might know, some of these terms you might not know. So let's see how we do. Okay, so this is a page. A page is defined as a single-sided piece of paper. Okay, so if this is a page, what do you know what it's called to have one page that is printed double-sided? Do you know what that term is called? That is called a leaf. So a single piece of paper printed on both sides is called a leaf. This is a what? This is one left-hand page and one right-hand page side by side. This is a spread. So a spread is two pages side by side. There is another term for one left-hand page and one right-hand page. Maybe it's what you guessed instead of the word spread. It's facing pages. So when we're talking about spreads in documents, we are working in facing pages. Facing pages means that we have right-hand pages and left-hand pages. And then there's a special term for the spread in the very middle of a document. Does anyone know what that one's called? It's called the center spread. The center spread is like the premier spread in a document because that is the place where the artwork is seamless. It goes all the way across the piece of paper. It's not like broken up onto a few different pages. You're not worried about the spine getting in the way. And when you're talking about things like magazine publishing, the center spread, it costs more to advertise in than a spread in any other part of the magazine. So it's a very premier spot. Okay, so now I took a screen grab of a page in InDesign. So depending on which order you're viewing the different InDesign demos in versus this lecture, you may or may not have really explored InDesign too much yet. So let's go over the different parts of a page. Maybe you remember, maybe you've seen the demos, maybe you know the answer, so feel free to shout them out, test your knowledge. Okay, so I just took a quick screen grab of a page I may set up in InDesign. We're going to go over the different elements of this page together. So the first thing is this black rectangle. What is the black rectangle denoting? It's denoting the trim or the final document size. So if I set my page up to 8.5 by 11, that black rectangle is showing me 8.5 wide by 11 inches tall. The term trim is also used to describe the act of cutting down a sheet of paper. So if you are going to trim something out, instead of saying like cut something out, we say trim. Okay, so trim is the final document size. All right, so what is this red line? This is the bleed. The bleed is the margin outside the trimmed area. The bleed allows for the images and other matter to print beyond the edge of the page in the design software. We want to do this to ensure that while we're trimming down our final document, if we have a little bit of an erroneous cut, we don't see just blank paper. We see the seamless ink coverage from edge to edge of our final trimmed document. So your bleed is your insurance. And anytime you're doing a document whether it's a multi-page document or just a single-page poster, if you have ink coverage from edge to edge, you always want to set a bleed and print on a larger piece of paper and trim it down to your final size. So what are these little marks on the corners of the page? You're not going to see these in InDesign. I have just added them in. These are representing your crop marks. So the crop marks are printed in the corners of the page to indicate the final size. So the crop marks appear when you go through your print dialog box and you check on crops and bleeds. So when the artwork is bleeding past the trim line, the crop marks help you to trim down your page to the final size that you intended. Okay. Now we have this pinky purple rectangle. Does anyone know what that is? That is your margin. We're going to talk about the margin again a little bit later into this deck, but the basic things you need to know about the margin are they are both functional and aesthetic, and they are the area between the main content and the edge of the page. The margin is going to define how closely the images and the text should approach the edges of the page. And you, designer, set the margins of the document. Okay, so if that was the margin, what is this space inside the page called? This is the column. So a column is a vertical block of content positioned on a page. This screen grab is showing you a 2-column page. The purpose of columns is to improve the composition and the readability. And the number of columns really depends on your design concept, readability factors, and again, the aesthetics of the design. You can have even columns or uneven column lists within a document. So if that was a column, what is this little space between the 2 columns called? This is called the gutter. So the column gutter is literally the space between columns. And it's good to know that the gutter should be smaller than your page margins. And it's also good to know that we use the same term gutter when we're referring to the inside margins closest to the binding of a bound document. So when you have a spread, the edge of the 2 pages that touch for the spread, those margins are the inside margins, our margins closest to the spine, and that is also called the gutter. Okay, good job. Next, we're going to talk about the grid. Okay, so here is just a couple sample spreads and pages from a magazine. So when we're designing with text type, aka a lot of content, the design becomes much more about the functionality than maybe being expressive, right? Because your main priority is really to ensure the ease of readability of the text for your reader. And the best way to do that is using grids. So a grid is the underlying structure of a multi-page document. Think about books, magazines, newspapers, brochures, websites, apps. A grid is a guide. It's a compositional structure made of verticals and horizontals that divide a format into columns and margins. This visual system or template organizes the text into an easily navigated and cohesive. So how did I determine what the grid was? I looked at where the content is, where the text is, and I was able to draw some vertical lines to denote the individual column, and then I could take that same width and apply it to the next column to see if those columns are even, and then to the 3rd column. Same thing on the website. And then I drew some horizontal guides where the tops of the different images were landing on the website, and again, the tops of the very top content on the magazine, and then on the very bottom content on the magazine. These grids onto these existing spreads, I think it's really helpful to deconstruct different designs that other people have made to try to really understand how the design was created And I think that helps you then create your own designs. So that is what we're going to do is this quick mid-lecture exercise. You're going to trace some grids. So what you're going to do is you're going to go back onto Blackboard under course projects, and there is a Blackboard assignment there called exercise something, I think 4, grid tracing. It's a PDF document. So you're going to download that PDF. You're going to open it in Adobe Acrobat, which was, if you have the symbol on your computer already, it's like a red square with a kind of like infinity sign on it. If you don't have Acrobat, you can definitely download it off your cloud service, or you can open this PDF in Illustrator and use the line tools of Illustrator if you're more comfortable doing it that way. You can open a multi-page document in multi-page PDF in Illustrator. Just go through the prompts. But if you do open Acrobat, this is what your document's going to look like. What you're going to do is you're going to open the comment tools, which I've boxed on the far right-hand side. It looks like a talk bubble. So if you open the comment tools, you get this comment toolbar of tools at the top of the screen there. And you can use the shapes, which I've boxed out, that drop down of shapes. You can use a line. So I drew a red line at the top where I feel like the top margin of this page is. Or you can use the pencil tool, and it's okay if it's really rough and squiggly. It's more just an act of you spending time analyzing these compositions and trying to pull out the underlying grids. So if it looks rough, that's fine. I'm not going to judge your mouse drawing skills. But what I want you to do is go through the different pages. There's 9 pages here. There's a few different designs, different documents. And I want you to trace the grids, just like I had done in the PowerPoint presentation. Trace the grids that you see in this PDF, resave the PDF, and re-upload it to Blackboard. This should only take you like 15-20 minutes. So once you're done with this and you've re-uploaded it to Blackboard, come on back to this PowerPoint lecture and resume the lecture. Okay? And again, if you have questions or trouble, I'm probably sitting in the Collaborate classroom right now, so pop on there and find me. Otherwise, you can always send me a quick email and I'll get back to you. Okay? I will see you all back here at this lecture as soon as you're done with this exercise. Have fun. Okay. Welcome back. Hopefully that exercise was easy and sort of helped reinforce understanding grid usage on various documents that have a lot of copy. Okay. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about margins. The margins are really your framework, and they play a significant role in the designing of grid structures, since they are, again, like I said, this framework that is defining where the body text and the other elements are going to sit on the page. So we already said at the beginning of the lecture that these margins are both functional and aesthetic, and they are the area between the main content and the edge of the page. And you as designer will define how closely the text and images will approach the edge of the page by defining your margins. So here's just 2 more examples of a print and a web application that are using margins. So I think you've seen on probably all of these examples I've shown you where different elements definitely can break the margins to create variety and visual relief and make your compositions a little more dynamic. Like in that print publication, the photograph is obviously a full bleed, bleeding to the edge of the page, busting past the margins. However, the content, the text, is all sitting within the margins. For a classic balanced printed page, you usually have equal side margins, and your top margin is always just a little bit smaller than your bottom margin. So if you have done any like mounting of artwork on board or in frames, you've probably also been told to make things look perfectly centered. You actually move your artwork just a little higher than center because then it will optically look centered. Same rationale for margins. If you're trying to get some text perfectly centered on a page, you actually want your top margin to be just a little smaller than your bottom margin. And it's also important to note that in digital design, the margins are still going to define and contain the text and other elements, but because of the active nature of digital design, like scrolling down the page, people can resize your browser window, which moves all your elements around. The margins are probably not as clearly defined or as large as they are on a printed design, but you are still designing websites and applications with a grid for sure, and part of your grid is definitely margins. All right. What's next? Okay. So grid structures. So you might be asking yourself, well, how many columns should my grid have? How do I know? So the most frequently designed grids are definitely 1, 2, or 3 columns. And the purpose behind the text, like what you're designing, the content of the concept or the content, the messaging of your text is really going to determine the appropriate width of your column, as well as, of course, your aesthetics. You still want to make something that looks nice. So typically, simple content may only need 1 column of text. Simple content being like a narrative, think of like a book, a novel, nonfiction story, a narrative, even if it's like an essay or maybe like a corporate brochure where there's a definitive story and it's pretty simple narrative. Could only maybe need 1 column of text. And then as you get into more complex types of content with maybe you have like charts or graphs or callouts or bullet points or sidebar information, images, the more complex and more varied the content is, the better a multi-column grid will help you create both clear visual hierarchy and readability. So here I just have 3 different column grid examples, and again, you can kind of see just some different grid design ideas here. Okay, so besides setting up a grid, you can definitely have some variation within your grid system, and within the same document you can have multiple grids. So a lot of multi-page formats, both print and digital, utilize more than 1 column structure within the same document or site. Often when you're on a website, your landing page will have a bunch of columns and a lot of choices for you. And then as you drill down into the content pages, it will switch into a single column format because it's a lot easier to read an article or like, text in a single column online than it is in a multi-column format. It's almost the exact opposite in print, where you might have less columns, a simpler structure for like section starts or divider pages to help the reader understand like something new is happening here, to call the reader's attention to a change of subject. And then as you get into the actual content and text of the section of the document, you might have multiple columns of information because in print, smaller line lengths are easier to read than longer line lengths. And again, they're all about ensuring maximum readability. So this example in front of you is one article in a magazine. You can see that this magazine uses a 4-column structure. However, the start of the article, the far left page, it is actually a 3-column structure with much wider side margins. And you can see how that 3-column structure is being utilized with that big full bleed photograph and that blue bar and the big headline text, and it's very easy to see even through my cyan grid and all of the crazy advertising and things happening on these spreads that that is the beginning of this article. Your eye is drawn to it. There's less information on the page. There's a bigger picture. You get that something important is happening. And then as you move through the article from left to right, you can see how the designer has laid out the article, and as well as the advertising and some extra pictures to separate the different types of content. So there is both layout variation within the same grid, where page 2, the text is on the 2 left columns, and then the 2 right columns is a big ad. Page 3, the text is on the top of all 4 columns, with the bottom of those columns being a big 2 ads. And then the same on the far right hand page. The text is on the top half of the page in 4 columns. There's an advertisement on the bottom, and there's a call out at the top as well with amongst the text. So we're using some variation in our layout within the same grid, and we're also using a different grid for the beginning of the article. I have another video posted to Blackboard where I walk you through the St. Louis Zoo has a quarterly magazine, and I just got their latest issue in the mail last week. And I think that magazine, it's pretty short, but it does a really nice job showing off variation within one grid, and as well as using different grids within the same publication in a very successful way. So definitely either now, take a break and go check that out, or later at some point, go check out that little video of me flipping through the St. Louis Zoo magazine and showing you the various spreads and how they're using their grids on that publication. And then you get to see my face. Woo! Okay, here we go. So anyway, there are like 2 main types of grids. The first one being a baseline grid. So all grids are really giving order to disorder, but your baseline grid is like you writing on lined paper. It's a whole bunch of these horizontal lines set up based on your leading choice. And what it does is the baseline grid forces all the text to base align. So the baseline of the text, if you remember from a few weeks back, is the very bottom of all the letter forms, where all the letter forms hit that imaginary horizontal line. That's called your baseline. So a baseline grid is like lined paper overlaid onto your document, and it forces all the text to land on a baseline. So if you're trying to like space out your leading, it's not going to move, and then it's going to jump to the next baseline of the document. So in these little screen grabs, I drew some pink horizontal lines across the 2 spreads to show you how the baseline is at play here. I didn't leave in every baseline because that would have gotten really kooky to look at, and you would not have actually been able to see what was happening. But you can kind of see how, if you squint, not only are the headlines obviously hitting at the same baselines from page to page, but the little orange subheadlines are hitting at the same place. The top of those orange headlines and the top of the images are hitting at the same place, and the bottom of that first column of text, the image is set to the same height as that column, which is also the same bottom line that all the text blocks except for one are hitting at. So you can see how everything is really falling in the same horizontal strip. That is working with a baseline grid. I personally find baseline grids really restrictive, but there is a button in InDesign where you can turn on a baseline grid and you can try to design within it and see how it goes. So you can try it out. I prefer this idea of a modular grid. So what a modular grid is, It's a grid that has both horizontal divisions but also vertical divisions. So you're making essentially a grid. And what you're using this grid for is to help you position all of your images and text in consistent ways from page to page, spread to spread. And you can see in this example that just like in those other magazine examples, there's images that are spanning across multiple modulars or like, cells of the grid. And the text is spanning, like 3 modulars over, but then the like little caption text is sitting with each within one little division. So it kind of gives you some flexibility that way, and it kind of helps with alignments. So I think this visual makes it a little more clear, where if you look at that first thumbnail on the top left, it's a 9-cell grid, right? If you think about all these dark gray squares as images and the light gray squares as text, I think you can really visualize how this modular grid works. So that first top left thumbnail is showing you basically like 9 images as like a contact sheet on a grid. The sketch over to it to the right would be like one really big photograph with some caption copy, right? And you can definitely imagine that on a page. And then similarly, I think if you go back to the first column, the second row in the first column, that would be like an image header across the top of a page, and then 3 columns of text. I think that makes a lot of sense to people, and you can imagine that in your mind, like, oh yeah, I've seen layouts like that. And then, so this is really showing you different ways that the same grid could be used on various layouts, whether it's print or digital. And that's why it's called modular, because you can use different widths and heights within these 9 cells to create your various layouts for your text and your images. Okay, and then I think your like third grid option is the more of an organic grid where you lay out a page or lay out a spread, and then however you land on that kind of alignment, whatever you like that spread looking like, you then translate over those margins, those columns, those column gutters, any other special like guides, whether they're horizontal or vertical that you're using to align specific content. And you translate that over into like your master page in InDesign. And you then, as you create more pages and more spreads using that same master grid, that's how you're still using a grid within your document. But it doesn't have to necessarily be a baseline grid or modular grid. It's more of just an organic grid based around the content and the document that you are creating. And I think that more organic style of grid making is the most common, unless you're working like at a magazine or newspaper or on website design, where sticking to a grid you have to really be very stringent about sticking to a grid. If you're designing things for like just your general business clients, for posters, more creative executions, more one-off executions, you don't have to be quite as regimented and templated, I think, as a modular or baseline grid is. So don't feel intimidated or restricted by either of those grid systems. Okay, so now we have some creativity within the grid. So I just have a few different examples of definite designs that are using a grid, but then are also having a little fun with it. So this first one is this little clown spread where there's clearly like a 3-column grid at play, but there's only text in 3 of the 6 columns of the spread. They have these nice big letters that spell out clowns. They're fun. The C is tilty. The clown's sitting on top. Like clearly the word clowns is breaking the grid, but it still feels very organized and it's very easy to read. So here's a couple more spreads. The one on the left, I like how there's a diagonal at play here. So while there's still a grid, there is a diagonal line that's sort of changing the shape of the text, which is fun. And then there's also some nice like overlapping of the photos and the red bars, and it creates a little bit more of a dynamic feel. And then you have the example on the right, which again, it's pretty organized. You could definitely see that as a template for multiple pages to talk about a bunch of different types of vegetables or foods. But I do like how the photograph of the leeks and the word leeks are definitely breaking the grid and busting out of those center columns. So again, creates some nice spatial depth, some nice variation, keeps it a little more active, I think. Okay, and then this is an example of like a couple pages of a brochure. And I think this is a really nice example of using a grid, but having variety of layout within the same grid through a document. So there's still definitely continuity from spread to spread, but there's also really nice variation. So you can see if you look at the Towering Achievement spread, there are 2 wider columns, and then on the very outside edge there's a very thin column. So this is again using an uneven columns. And they're using the 2 wider columns for text or for pictures, and then there's like that little sidebar of uneven column on the right page. The left page, it's a big illustration. And then the spread below at the bottom, you can see how on the right hand page there's still those like 2 columns of information. The subhead goes all the way across, and that little sidebar column is again being used for secondary information. And then on the right, or on the left, it's a nice like photographic spread where it's the same 2 column widths and then that third skinny column, but instead of having text in any of them, they have photos, but they're maintaining that same column gutter to break up the images. So that was a really nice way to use their grid system to make everything look different but cohesive, which is a successful layout using a grid. That's what you're looking for. Okay. So let's see. Breaking the grid. So while you're having fun within the grid, it's definitely important to make sure, you have variety within your grid to break up the monotony, but without destroying the consistency. And all your aesthetic choices, like your typeface selection, your point size, your margins, your columns, all of that is helping to improve the readability and the comprehension for the reader. Sometimes you want to break the grid. And sometimes it's more about being, creative and like fanciful than really completely functional. But a lack of grid is going to challenge your reader, and at a certain point it's going to turn your reader into a viewer, which means they're no longer reading all the words on the page. They are just looking at your spread, right? So that's really important distinction to keep in mind, because it depends on what the purpose of your document is, where that line is, like how far you can break the grid where it's still interesting and successful and still readable, if that is truly the most important part about what you're doing. And you can also definitely like break the grid maybe like on like one spread in a larger document, maybe in like interesting ways, but every page doesn't have to be breaking the grid. Use it appropriately. And I picked out these 2 examples because I think they're showing breaking the grid in 2 really different ways. So the page on the left, yeah, I can read that the headline says breaking the grid. And yeah, I can see there is some sort of a grid structure to this, and I could read most of it if I wanted to. But the yellow text is very hard to almost impossible to read, and the way it's overlaid under the body copy makes the body copy tough to read. And then the like second column is right aligned, and it's kind of weird, and this whole page is challenging to read as a reader. And you know what? I might be like, it's too much work, I'm not going to read it, and I might just move on. So that's when it becomes important to understand, is it okay if my reader doesn't necessarily read this whole page and just looks at it and moves on? I feel like the Lash Bash spread with all the mascaras breaks the grid in a much more successful way as far as readability goes. Like, yeah, obviously there's like a fun collage of mascaras and somebody has just set the type to align to the various mascaras, but they've set the type into these smaller column blocks, so it's not like too much information to read at once. I don't mind reading a little bit of content on an angle because it's still doable. It's just a small amount of information. And so this spread, I feel like, is still very readable while still very much not on a grid. So two just very different approaches to breaking the grid and, again, thinking about what is the purpose behind what you're designing. Okay, and then I threw this slide in here to show you how we sketch out our grid design ideas. So just because you're working on a multi-page document doesn't mean you're going to abandon your creative process. It's still a lot of pen on paper, thumbnail sketching in the beginning before you move to the computer. And I think it's really helpful to know that there is a language that designers and copywriters and different marketing people understand for thumbnail sketching, text, and pictures. And this is what it is. So if you squint really hard, there are sketched out individual pages, like and this has been sketched out into spreads where there are two spreads in a row and there's two columns of spreads. And then on each spread, there are rectangles. So the rectangles with the squiggly lines in them, that means those are copy blocks. The squiggly lines represent text, and the rectangles with X's in them denote images. So any sort of photograph, illustration, any visual is being denoted by an X'd out box, and the squiggles are being denoted by text blocks. And then the general rule of thumb is when you're going to talk about your text blocks, the bigger your squiggle, the bigger the text is supposed to be. Thinking about how like the peaks and valleys of the squiggle is the height of the capital letters. So the bigger the squiggle, the bigger the font. The littler the squiggle, the littler the font, to the point where if you're going to have just like little bitty copy, you might just have straight horizontal lines to denote the copy instead of squiggles if you wanted. And I think you can kind of see how right in this these sketches, someone is thinking about what kind of grid structure do I want to use? Am I going to have 3 columns? Am I going to have, 6 columns or 5 columns? How am I going to lay the photos across with the content? And these are just different ways this is how you sketch. You can see on one of his examples, there's a picture spanning the spread versus, having the text on one side and the pictures on the other, that kind of thing. So that is how you sketch page layouts with boxes. And if you wanted like a circle photo, like a photo in a circle or something like that, like you would definitely like sketch the shape that is the shape that the image would be in. So you can definitely sketch more organically as well, or if you're going to have like a color swoosh, you would just like draw that in as a straight line and people would know that that's what you're talking about as well. But anytime you want to put a picture in a shape, you put an X in the shape, and that's how people know image. Okay, so here's our little grid recaps slide, the benefits of using a grid. A grid maintains alignment. A grid defines boundaries and keeps content in order. A grid establishes an underlying structure to maintain clarity, balance, and unity. And a grid gives visual consistency and flow. I think this visual kind of sums it up very nicely. No grid, people swimming in the ocean all willy-nilly. Grid, people swimming in their lanes in the pool where it's very organized. Everyone has their own little lane. No one's crashing into each other. And that is why we use a grid. Okay. So next we're going to talk about the different aspects of building a book. So again, we're talking about multi-page design. We're talking about using grids on interior content. Now we have to talk about how are we going to hold all these pieces of paper together. So, what type of spreads are these an example of? I have a photograph of a book, and I have some thumbnails of pages numbered. These are reading spreads or viewing spreads. Reading spreads are showing the consecutive pages in two-page spreads. They are the correct order that someone is going to read a document. So the photograph is a physical document that someone can read. So page 4 and 5 are next to each other as a spread. And the graphic on the right is showing what your pages palette would look like in Illustrator or in InDesign, where you've got pages 2 and 3 are a spread, pages 4 and 5 are a spread. So those are called reading spreads. So if those are called reading spreads, do you know what this image might be depicting? This is depicting printer spreads. So printer spreads are not consecutive in order. They are in an order so that when the document is printed and trimmed and assembled, the pages do appear consecutively in reader spreads. So you can see in this visual, what it's saying is this is an 8-page document. So pages 1 and 8 are put next to each other in a printer spread so that when it goes through the printer and is trimmed out and then folded in half, page 1 becomes the cover and page 8 is the back cover. And now it's in the correct order to read the book. So those are printer spreads. Do we design in reading spreads or printing spreads? We design in reading spreads. So you're designing in page 1, page 2, 3, page 4, 5, page 6, 7, page 8. You're designing in the order with which someone is going to read the document. So because we set our documents up in InDesign using facing pages, the software is able to convert our reading spreads into a printer spread and print our document so that it can then be trimmed and folded and read properly. So the software does all the work for you nowadays, which is amazing. So to do it, you go up under File, Print Booklet, and the Print Booklet setting is what tells the software to export out you a printer spread of your document. So as long as you're working in facing pages, you're good to go. And the printer spread is really important. Anytime you're printing something that's going to print in spreads, like a saddle-stitched book, which we would have made if we were in class together, but we're not. So you kind of are getting off the hook and having to really worry about printing these things out. But I think it's really important that you at least hear about it now, because eventually you're going to get back into school and you're going to have to print stuff out. Okay, and so flat-sized versus finished size. Do you all know which is which? So the finished size is the thing on the right. It is just the cover of this book. It refers to the final dimension of the document after it's been printed and trimmed and folded. So the final trim size is the finished size versus the flat size. The flat size is the total height by the total width of a spread. So like if you're going to print out this cover, it's the back cover plus the spine plus the front cover, that total width by the height. And obviously documents that don't fold, like a poster, only have one dimension, so the flat size and the finished size are the same. But why it's really important to understand your flat size is if you are printing booklets that are going to print in spreads, you have to make sure your total spread size is smaller than the physical size of the paper you're going to print on, because digital paper only comes in so many sizes, and like in the classroom we can only print on 11 by 17. So your brochure or whatever you're designing has to be smaller than basically 16.5 inches wide by 10.5 inches tall to be able to fit on the page, and that the printing machine still has room to grip the paper and print you your crops and bleeds and your artwork. So that is why your flat size becomes very important when you're working on that kind of stuff. Okay, so now let's talk about some binding methods. So you have basically 4 choices when binding a multi-page document. From the top going clockwise, you have your spiral binders. So these documents are pretty inexpensive. They're really great for like annual reports or sales decks or pitch decks, things that need to be produced quickly. They're, they're printed, each page is printed as a leaf, and it's then punched and bound. And you as the designer can spec out the color of the wire binding you want. The bindings come in all different sizes to account for the different thicknesses of your books. Your next choice going clockwise is your perfect binding, which is more what your like paperback books are going to be, sometimes like soft cover textbooks. Perfect binding is a soft cover, meaning it's not a hard cardboard cover, but it's floppy. It can be thicker. It's thicker paper than the text pages, but it's still not rigid. So it's soft cover. It's individual leaves of paper stacked on top of each other, and then there's glue applied to the side, and the whole interior of the book is fitted inside the cover and squashed till the glue dries. So it's done with glue to keep all your pages in your book. Perfect binding is going to be your most expensive option, but it also only works if you have a lot of pages, because you need at least a 1/16 of an inch of height of pages stacked on top of each other for the glue to have enough surface area to stick together and stick to your spine. But again, you're probably going to be producing a large volume of these books if you're perfect binding a book, so then it becomes more cost effective. The next thing is that little folded brochure. So sometimes if you don't have a ton of content, you don't actually need a binding at all. You can just fold your piece. And you could, in graphic design 2, we go over all kinds of folding methods. Your simple trifolds, your more exciting like roll folds or accordion folds, to get your information without any binding whatsoever. And then your last option, all the way on the left there, the staple, is called a saddle stitch. It is literally a staple book, but we call it a saddle stitch. And this is the type of book where you're printing it in spreads, in printer spreads, and folding it, and all of a sudden it becomes reader spreads. This is where your flat size becomes really important. And this is probably the most popular option for shorter documents. Think like under 40-ish pages, because you can have nice full coverage ink. It's pretty inexpensive. These can be printed digitally. Business clients really like these books. They're just like a nice, economical, but professional looking option. Okay, so those are your various binding methods. Wire, perfect, folded, saddle stitched. All right, and our last section are our 5 design considerations when designing a long format document. Okay, so our first consideration is will this piece be part of an existing visual identity system? More times than not, when you're working out in the world, when you're asked to design something, there are already existing pieces in some sort of cohesive visual style for your client. Whether they have an official brand guide, an official visual identity system, or they just have a bunch of other disparate items, there's probably some sort of visual consistency that you as a designer should look for and try to utilize. Why? Because, the thing you're designing has to match the rest of the things that are already designed. So here's an example of a company. They clearly have a specific blue color palette. There's that like water wavy graphic that's being used on the various pieces in different ways. They're treating their headlines the same way with this all caps with a horizontal line through it. There's a certain font that's being used. There might be some commonality between like how they treat subheaders or how they like to align their text, whether it's justified or left aligned. Those kinds of things you as a designer should look at and assess, and then use what you can or what you want to for your new piece so that your new thing fits within all the other things. In school, that's not as much of an issue because you get to pretty much do whatever you want, but it's good to know for moving forward. The next consideration is, what's the content? So you, designer, have to read the content of whatever you're designing. There's no way that you can start figuring out the best way to help a reader read the content if you yourself have no idea what it says, right? So you have to understand the hierarchy of information, what types of information is included. Reading the content helps you pull out the key visuals. Maybe there's parts of the text that you want to call special attention to because they are the most critical for the reader to truly comprehend. So step one is read the content. Usually your content is given to you as a Word document, and you will just copy and paste the content out of the Word document into your InDesign document. But the first thing you're going to do before you start sketching is read. A lot of times too, there are certain visuals that have been provided for you. Everything from logos to different images that maybe are specific that the content is calling out that you have to use. There might be other images that are more optional. There's a brand library of photographs that you could choose from. There could be charts, there could be graphs, there could be icons. So you have to look at all the information that was given to you, text and pictures. And then as you sketch, make sure that you account for all the different things you have to include in your spreads. The third consideration is, what format should be used to best communicate the content, or what format has been requested. Sometimes you're being asked to create specifically a wire-bound book, and sometimes you're being asked to make a recommendation on what type of binding would be appropriate for the content. So again, things you have to consider. Things you're going to consider if you get the option to make a recommendation are going to be like total page length, total quantity that are going to be printed. Those kind of things will help you determine what will be the best option or a couple options for your client. And then your next consideration is going to be, are there any technical limitations? Technical limitations are things outside of your control that you have to make sure that you adhere to. 3 examples on this screen would be, we need a brochure that's going to fit in this acrylic holder. The acrylic holder holds brochures up to 8 by 10. Okay, so I better make sure my brochure is 8 by 10 or smaller, right? So it physically fits in the holder it's being designed for. Another technical limitation is, we need to make a self-mailer. Okay, well I better make sure there's a panel on this brochure that has room to do mailing. I better make sure that the whole shape of this mailer, when folded, fits within the Postal Service's regulations, right? I have to make sure that if this is a self-mailer that it can physically be mailed. And then another type of technical limitation would be, you're designing an instruction guide that's going in a package, like into a box, like in this picture. So the box's dimensions are, 8 by 10. Okay, well, I better make sure that my instructions are smaller than 8 by 10. And it could get even more specific than that. It could be like, we want to put the instructions tucked, on the side, so that side of the box is really only 4 by 5. Okay, so again, you need to know your technical limitations when designing. Other technical limitations could be like, we're only going to print in black ink with no bleed. Okay, well, I better make sure my design accounts for only black ink with no bleed. That kind of stuff. And someone will give you your technical limitations when you start a project. So those are things that are pretty known from the get-go. If no one says anything, just ask, are there any technical limitations I should be aware of? And see what anyone says. And then your last consideration, again, is what's the budget? Obviously, different types of printing cost different amounts of money. And then also, if you as designer want to suggest special printing techniques like spot gloss or foil stamping or embossing or a die cut, all of those things cost money too. And so it's really important to know up front, is there a budget? What is the budget? So you don't start suggesting things that you know your client can never afford. So that's an easy one. The end. You made it to the end of this lecture. Hopefully that was helpful.